Gentle readers, welcome to Everything is Everything. I'm Amit, this is Ajay, and we have two pieces of good news for you, which are that I'm Amit and he's Ajay. No. We have two actual pieces of good news for you. We will sandwich the show with them. You know, Ajay Shah, people refer to economics as a dismal science. We are harbingers of bad news. Especially you and me, we keep complaining about this country it's like this, politics is like this, economics is like this. But good things are happening in these very domains. And one of them was presaged by you, if that is the correct word. One of them you had predicted would happen in an earlier episode. So kindly tell us which episode, what had you predicted, what has happened?
We did 2 episodes on globalization. In the second of the 2 episodes, I had ended with a rather happy view of things. Okay, in this gloomy world, I said, this is both an opportunity for India to do some right things, and my opinion, my reading of the situation is that good things are in store. Okay, that was my reading of the situation based on reading newspapers and understanding the chessboard. That's all. I mean, I'm by no means an insider. I look at the pieces and I can figure what the moves can be. And I'm absolutely delighted that the first piece of that kind of story has actually happened, which is a decent free trade agreement between India and the UK. Okay, now I have only read the newspaper stories, and that's something that's a no-no. You should always read legal documents. You should never be content with a newspaper version. But in the newspaper versions, roughly speaking, there seem to be the following kind of stories, that there is a reduction now in tariffs on 90% of the products, okay, which is nice. And there's a 10-year glide path where many tariffs gradually go down. Okay, in my opinion, we should have done 5 years, but fine, 10 years. It fits the concept that firms should be given certainty that tariffs will go down. Then firms have to take a good hard look at themselves. Either you're going to go out of business or you have to increase your productivity. Okay, and it's great. And also, because protectionism is going down, some people's raw materials are becoming cheaper. So they're actually becoming more competitive. And I'm delighted to say that for 80% of the products at the end of 10 years, the tariff is contracted under the treaty to reach a number of 0. Okay, that is cool. Like 0 tariffs. Okay, that is what we economists know. Seldom in Indian life do you actually get a 0 tariff. This is like really good stuff. Now, I'm sure the devil is in the details. The 80% of the products where the tariff is 0 may be products which don't really get exported from the UK. There'll be shades of grey, but still I am quite happy at many of these developments. Then again, I read a newspaper story that the treaty envisages that UK companies will be able to compete in the procurement of the Indian government. Okay, so when the Indian government wants to buy steel, a British steel company will be able to bid in that alongside an Indian steel company. Okay, this is big. This is a material improvement for India's interests, meaning it's really important. The Indian government should be buying things at the lowest price possible. Okay, like you tell the taxpayers, I'm buying the steel to make a police station. You should buy that steel at the lowest possible price. You should never pay a premium. There should be no other conflicts of interest. For the first time, I think we are in an environment where British companies will be able to compete in government procurement. Now, government procurement in India works badly. There will be many hoops to jump. There will be many frictions. So we ain't done. But I feel that there is a shift in the tone, in the kind of ideas that I have read in the newspaper stories around this FTA. So I find it delightful. Also, once you've got 0 tariff with one country, what's the point of having tariffs with anybody else? So it also connects with the idea that there will be a tariff deal with the Americans, with the Europeans, with the Japanese. It's like once you get tariffs down to 0 with some, why bother keeping them with others? So it could all potentially add up to something more meaningful, and that was that happiness we showed at the end of the globalization episode, that potentially this is turning into a big day in India's globalization.
I have 3 things to say. One is to you, gentle reader, that we are recording this on May 8th. The episode will actually come out 3 weeks from now. And so more good things could have happened, or this could have gone to hell. We don't know. But on May 8th, this is how things are. The second thing is a great movie idea. This can be a blockbuster film called Return to Zero. India invented 0, and now these tariffs are going to go back to 0.
And now the foreigners are bringing 0 back to India.
And the foreigners are bringing, we have decided to bring zero back to India. The third thing I want to say is, Ajay Shah, धिक्कार on you. You economists, you policy people have been trying for decades कि trade liberalize करो, tariffs नीचे करो, ये करो, वो करो. When did it happen? Who got it done? Donald Trump got it done.
Absolutely.
You could not get the job. Donald Trump got it done.
So, Amit bhai, you and I should nominate Donald Trump for the Bharat Ratna.
He's joking. You know, people are going to like clip this and put this on Twitter and say कि अरे he's a Trump bhakt and all that. We got to be careful. So, the second piece of good news relates to the subject of this episode, which is regulation. So, we're going to come to that news at the end. First, we're going to talk about regulation. And here's the deal. We've done a bunch of episodes which, in a sense, lead up to this, right? And I want to begin with episode 25. And the reason I'm sort of doing this little preamble is to set a certain context that I am very skeptical of the word regulation. I think it is necessary, but so rarely and only sometimes, and I need to kind of talk about why that is the case. So I'll just share my point of view here and what are the leading schools of thought in regulation and how the field has evolved. And then Ajay is like the India expert on the subject. He will take over and give us a masterclass. In episode 25, we spoke about the purpose of the state, that the purpose of the state comes into being in the liberal conception to protect our rights. And there is that great liberal paradox. We are giving away some of our rights because after all we are granting it the monopoly on violence. We give away some of our rights so it can protect our rights. And how does it protect our rights? By putting something in place which we would call in a very broad, as a broad umbrella term, the rule of law. That it will make sure that there is no murder, there's no robbery, property rights are protected, there's no cheating, contract enforcement, etc., etc. All of this falls under the rubric of what we call the rule of law. And the rule of law protects us from our protectors as well. The idea of the rule of law is that everyone knows what the law is. The law applies equally to everyone. Everyone goes through a due process. The prosecutor is not the judge, they are separate, and equally it is predictable and reliable. You know what the law is tomorrow, it is not suddenly going to change. All these are the rule of law. Now, the way that I think of what happens in society after this is that markets work beautifully when the rule of law is well enforced. I think of competition as the best regulation. You know, I want to serve Vaishnav. You want to serve Vaishnav better because you want his money too in that double thank you moment, the positive sum game. We compete against each other and thus doing we keep each other honest. We have to do our best to not, we can't cheat him, we have to provide him the best services, etc., etc. So in a marketplace which is functioning well, competition is the best regulation. However, there are rare instances where this is not the case and where you then need to think about what kind of intervention is possible. Now, episode 26 of Everything is Everything, Ajay gave this great masterclass on when can the state intervene, when should the state intervene. And what you outlined there is essentially what is also known as the public interest theory, welfare economics, different ways to describe it. But a broad summation of that is there are 4 different kinds of market failures. Now, this is a technical term. Market failures doesn't mean that when the market fails to give you something you want, you call it a market failure. These are technical terms. There are just 4 different kinds of market failures which Ajay had outlined over there. And if any of these happen, then the state can intervene without harming anyone, and it can, that is when it is permissible for the state to intervene. But each of these are necessary and not sufficient conditions, right? Just because there is a market failure doesn't mean that you should intervene. There are lots of things to consider.
It may be permissible.
It may be permissible. There are lots of things to consider, and most of the time, in my opinion, it's better to actually do nothing. Some of the time, fine, you should intervene. For example, a classic example being the negative externality of air pollution. If it gets beyond a certain point, the market can't sort it out on its own, then fine, that's where it is, that's when it's okay to intervene, you should intervene. But by and large, you don't have to intervene every time that you see a market failure. Now, if you actually look at the world of regulation, you realize that a lot of regulations that are out there are not correcting for market failures. There's no apparent market failure there. So what exactly is going on? So economists a few decades ago then came up with what was then called capture theory, where the idea was a state has some power and different groups, special interest groups, different lobbies will capture the state, as it were, and they'll capture the regulatory process and they'll use regulation for their own good. And this needed further evolution because it still didn't explain everything. George Stigler wrote a famous essay in 1971 called The Theory of Economic Regulation, and that lays out three axioms, right? Axiom one is that the state has a monopoly on violence, it has coercive power. Axiom 2, any private party that collaborates with the state or gets a state to use that coercive power for its own use can actually benefit from it. And axiom 3, that therefore it is in the rational self-interest of every private person to try to collaborate with the state or influence the state in that way so that it can benefit. It is just rational self-interest. Everyone's going to want to do it, which means you have to be super careful. And what therefore happens is, and it's happened in a very drastic way in America, perhaps more so than even in India, is that interest group starts forming. So there'll be a lobby of small traders which will say that, ban FDA to protect us. And there will be, Falana lobby saying save us from Dhimkana. And Dhimkana lobby saying those Falana guys are bad guys, save us, we are good for the consumers. And therefore you have different lobbying groups which come into play, and all of them benefit from one phenomenon which public choice theorists call concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. So for example, if a company gets a government to place a tax on us, which takes 1 rupee from our pockets every year, the costs are diffused. All of us are losing 1 rupee. It is such a small amount of money, we won't even notice. I mean, I am more likely to notice than you are, but we won't even notice, and therefore we won't complain, and it doesn't matter. But that company which got that tax through for itself, 1 rupee from every person in the country is a lot of rupees. I won't even do the math. And for them, it is worth it. And they are quite happy to give 30% of that to their MPs and, to the corporators and etc., to make sure the laws go through. And this phenomenon means that all of us lose many 1 rupees. And it's obviously you're not taking money from people's pockets, but every regulation harms the people. But the cost is so small when you think of it in individual terms, and so invisible, the unseen as it were, that we don't even notice and we don't protest. That, oh my God, there's an entry barrier in this market to protect that player, and that without that entry barrier, goods would be cheaper for me. I would save 2 rupees, but I don't even know I would save 2 rupees, or that I have notionally lost 2 rupees. But all those 2 rupees have now gone to the interest group in place. In America, this became a crisis, in fact, decades ago. There's a great book by Jonathan Rauch called Government's End, which blew my mind when I read it. And in that, he coined the term demosclerosis. His point was, what happens is that the interest groups just multiply. All of these regulations just grow and grow and grow. And it becomes almost impossible to reverse any of them or to stop the tide that is happening. And it crowds out the space for other policy making. Everything basically becomes about this. You go to DC, there's a joke, you throw a stone in one direction, you'll hit a legal firm, throw a stone in another direction, you'll hit a lobbying firm, so on and so forth. A friend in DC told me this joke, and it kind of makes a lot of sense. And this is deeply insidious and difficult to counter. Rauch also writes in his book that when he first came to Washington, he remembers in the mid-80s chatting with a gentleman named David Stockman. And David Stockman was Reagan's czar,
OMB.
Yeah. He was Reagan's man, and we all know, the rhetoric of Reagan that I'm going to make government small and lean and I'm going to clean it up. And Stockman was deeply depressed and feeling bitter and saying that, we came here with such good intentions, but it is so difficult to get anything done. He is a president's man. Imagine, it's hard for the president to get anything done. Subsequently, Rauch talks about how both Bill Clinton, the Democrat, and Newt Gingrich, the Republican, they tried in different ways to do the same thing, and they failed miserably because it is just incredibly hard to do. The whole system is sort of crawling with this. And this fits in with capture theory sometimes, in the sense that you can see an interest group sort of take over the regulatory process, but not always. And it also fits in with the public interest theory, because a lot of regulation, it's very easy to couch it in terms of either the public interest in a general sense or to actually invoke an actual market failure. There's a great essay by Bruce Yandel, the regulatory economist, called Baptists and Bootleggers. And the phenomenon he describes there is this, and it's a beautiful way of thinking about how regulation works. He says that a Baptist who is a priest, a Baptist, will essentially lobby for a regulation that calls for prohibition. Because his funda is that drinking is immoral, and in India the argument would be men are beating their wives, domestic violence goes up, etc., etc., crime goes up, drinking is immoral. The government bans drinking, and you might think, yeah, this is a good thing, this should happen. And then what happens is that banning drinking, and we have an episode on victimless crimes that talks about this, banning drinking doesn't solve the problem, because you will then have the underground come up and bootleggers will make a lot of money. So guess who are the two people who should technically be aligned here and often are? The Baptist and the bootlegger. Often, sometimes explicitly, the bootlegger will fund the Baptist to carry out his campaign. In fact, when the Shah Rukh Khan film Raees came out, I wrote about how that got the basic economics wrong, because there was a politician going through town in the film who was arguing for prohibition, and Shah Rukh Khan was a bootlegger trying to stop him. And I'm like, wait a minute, it is in the bootlegger's interest to have prohibition, because that is how his business flourishes. And this is one example. We have many modern examples. For example, tobacco companies have been big supporters of FDA pre-regulation for new cigarettes coming to the market, obviously because they want market barriers. We did an episode on diabetes where we spoke about what the sugar lobby did in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, where it funded a lot of fraudulent studies that appeared to show that sugar was fine and fat was the problem, right? So that's a situation that you saw happening. And you might argue that, hey, interest groups are obviously going to do this, but what about the government? The government is supposed to be this benevolent, my baap kind of creature which will not allow it to happen. Well, we had this great episode on public choice theory, and the fundamental insight of public choice theory is that people respond to incentives and governments are manned by people, right? So every bureaucrat wants to expand his budgets and the size of his department. Every politician wants to do whatever will get him elected in the next cycle, whether it is pandering to the populist instincts of the voters, as the case might be, or whether it is in terms of securing funding by doing a quid pro quo for an interest group which is funding him. And you actually see this in America, where if you just follow the funds, you can tell what side each legislator is going to be batting for. It's a deeply corrupt system, despite all the high-minded rhetoric. So the danger is that the whole regulatory process gets taken up in this manner. The other great insight of public choice theory is that no one is omniscient. We assume the government must be omniscient, they have all the knowledge that there is, but they're not omniscient, and the result of that is that government failure is ubiquitous. We talk about market failure, but market failure is rare. Government failure is ubiquitous. Now, let's take an example of this. Let's take the FDA. Right? Like, whenever I have to decide whether to take a medicine or not, I simply assume that if the FDA in the US has approved it, it is absolutely kosher, 100% safe, and that is correct. But that is a seen. What is not seen is that the reason that anything they approve is so good is because the process of approvals are so incredibly long that they cost lives. They will often take 7-8 years longer than necessary to approve something, because the procedures are so rigid, and they will sell that under the guise of we are looking after the people and etc., etc. But what you don't count is the lives that are lost, that might have been saved had the medicines actually been in place. There's a great book about this which really also gave me a new framework to think about the world, called Fortress and Frontier in American Healthcare by Robert Grabois. He won the Bassia Prize in 2014, if I remember correctly, the year before I won it for the second time. And it's a brilliant book, and the framework that it introduces is of Fortress and Frontier, where he talks about how healthcare regulation is like a fortress, right? They really protect it from the inside. The walls are high, it's very hard to get through. And instead, he contrasts it with the frontier, which is a world of tech, which is a world of IT and AI and everything that is happening there, where anybody can come in and try different things, and you have so much flourishing going on. And his case is not that you do away with the FDA and you kind of let everything go out there, but is a much more nuanced case. But leave that aside, that's a separate sort of healthcare issue. But it's an example of how even when there is regulation which appears to solve for what is a market failure, in this case asymmetric information, it can also lead to a different kind of failure where you could lose more lives than you save. And that math, of course, is impossible to do. And when I think about regulation, I think very much with the way Hayek and Mises in the Austrian school would have thought. That by and large, if there is a good rule of law, and I again want to go back to the term rule of law and say rule of law and regulation are different things. People will think of regulation and say, oh, these evil capitalists must be controlled, otherwise anything goes, it's a Wild West. No, 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 no. You have to have a strong rule of law. But once you have the strong rule of law, how much regulation do we need? And Hayek's point would be that when you have the price system working well and when the rule of law is in place, you need very little regulation. In fact, Hayek and Mises point to what they call an interventionist spiral, right? So you decide that there is some kind of problem that you want to solve, and then you solve it. You try to solve it with a regulation. That regulation leads to downstream consequences, which you have to solve for with more regulation, and so on down the line. A classic example of this is that you begin with rent controls. Now, you being a card-carrying economist is tired of telling people that all price controls are bad. Rent controls always lead to shortages. So then rent controls will lead to housing shortages. Government will say, let's do something about this. Let's have housing subsidies. And then you have housing subsidies. And then you have, zoning laws put in place. And gradually everything just starts to go to hell. When you have a spiral of that sort. So it is not even as if you're trying to solve a problem, you come up with a regulation and that kind of solves everything. So the reason I wanted to go on this little potted history of the ideas around regulation and talk about this is that I feel that our default attitude towards regulation should be extreme skepticism, that whenever regulation is proposed or whenever we look at an existing regulation, there are a number of questions we need to ask. The questions include, who does this benefit? Who does this hurt? And what are the unintended consequences down the road? And I think the moment we do that, a lot of things can kind of become clear. So that is the conceptual lens through which I look at it. I think regulation can sometimes be a necessary evil. I'll allow you to convince me on that. But most of the time, we should be supremely skeptical. And as you will point out, in India, so many things have gone wrong so persistently that we have to think hard about fixing them.
Chapter 2, I just want to introduce terminology. Okay, so let's agree on terms and get our definitions right. Regulation is this business of state intervention that is oriented towards coercing firms. Okay, generally firms, meaning rarely are individuals a target of regulation. It is the business of the state coercing firms. Regulators are a specialized arm of the state that does regulation. Okay, so you can have a department of government engaged in regulatory activities. That's allowed. It's your choice. This is a public administration decision. Do you wish to do it under the rubric of a government department, or do you wish to fork a specialized agency who will do regulation, and then that's called a regulator. So regulators only do regulation, but not all regulation is done by regulators. Okay. Third, I want to introduce the word regulatory theory. Okay. Very many people are used to looking at one field at a time. So you can discuss drug regulation, you can discuss securities regulation, you can discuss banking regulation. Regulatory theory is the general technology of regulation. It is ideas, the principles that really horizontally apply across all kinds of regulation. So there is a legitimate business of knowledge creation and deep understanding of the regulation of airports. Okay, and I'm not at all slamming the people who do that deeply, but I wish to say to them that, you know what, there's actually a general technology, and so what you need to do is you need to build airport specific knowledge on top of the foundational knowledge of regulatory theory, which is actually working across domains. Whether you're regulating banks or you're regulating airports or you're regulating drugs, it's basically the same. Okay, so these are the three terms: regulation, regulators, and regulatory theory. Now, why would you have regulation? Why would the state ever have a legitimate case for coercing private firms? And you correctly said it is rooted in market failure. There may be an argument to interfere in the lives of the firms and coerce them to behave in certain ways. So at this point, I just wish to do a little bit of a classification system. If there is a public goods problem, that the society needs a public good, then regulation is seldom the answer. If it's a positive externalities problem, like building an R&D system, we had an episode on innovation policy, that is seldom a regulation problem. If it's a negative externality problem, that there are fossil fuel companies pushing carbon dioxide in the air, there may be a case for regulation. If there is an asymmetric information problem, there may be a case for regulation. And finally, if there is a market power problem, there may be a case for regulation. So it's not even true that all kinds of market failure may justify coercing firms and setting up a regulator. There is 1.5 cases where really you don't need a regulator. That's not the appropriate intervention. So there are different kinds of interventions to use when you face a public goods problem. You really want the government to either make the public good or buy the public good from private firms. Or when there is a positive externality, you want a voucher type solution, okay, and it's not a regulation type solution. So for 1.5 problems, it's not regulation. For 2.5, it can be regulation, and this is something to consider. So this is my first preamble of introducing terms and showing the domain, that the world of regulation is either you have market power or asymmetric information or negative externalities being done by firms. Then there may be a case for regulation, and then maybe you could do it in a government department, or you could do it in a standalone agency which would be called a regulator. And the subject of constructing regulation without reference to the narrow domain is called regulatory theory.
I love the way you say regulation and regulator. I could listen to you all day.
This is irritating and infuriating. These words get bandied about so much, and people are very loose. Oh, but Sarkar has to do some regulation, but the regulator has this problem. So you just have to fight about these things. So forgive me, this is a lifetime of angst, which is I'm trying to clearly articulate. Guys, be clear on these 3 things. Okay, so now let's turn to the why. That, yeah, you could have a department of government which could coerce firms to behave in certain ways. Why bother setting up a regulator? What is the benefit of setting up a regulator? First, I want to take you back to the early 1990s, where there was a thought and there was an opinion on why this might be worth doing. The claim at the time was that the culture of government departments is horrible. They're deeply interventionist. They don't get modern economics. And to break away from central planning, we need to build a new organizational culture. We need much more modern, market-oriented people. We need a mix of economists and industry practitioners. That's never going to happen in a government department. So we should create a regulator. Okay, these kinds of things were said in the early 90s. Okay, I hate to break your bubble. It didn't happen at all. There is no part of the Indian state today where regulators are like this. They are just the same culture, the same capability as a government department. So this was a nice dream. It was a nice story. It was not adequately grounded in regulatory theory, and so it did not happen. So the people that had such wishes did not have the level of legal and public administration knowledge to actually make it happen. If you wish to do it today, I feel we know how to do it. But at the time, they did not know how to do it. So there was a gap of knowledge. And so none of this happened. And this is also not deeply the way the rest of the world works. Okay, so what are the reasons for doing a regulator in regulatory theory? So one piece is kind of related, that in a government department, first of all, you have like an every 5 years transfer. So people are moving around departments a lot, and it's almost random. Like one day you could be doing civil aviation, next day you could be doing defense. Like there's no rhyme or reason. The fundamental HR process of government is deeply generalist. In a regulator, you can think that we can have a little more specialization, and it has gone to the other extreme, like cradle to grave lifetime employment in a regulator has its own problems. But for example, I would dream that there would be job rotation between regulators. So one day I'm regulating airports, one day I'm regulating drug companies. That seems good. That you stay in the subject matter of regulation, you develop a general capability of regulatory theory, and then you keep switching between organizations and domains. You don't become too narrowly centered on one organization, one political dynamic of one organization, and the entrenchment of an organizational culture and the politics of an organization. So I get that this can help. In India, we've done neither of these two good ideas. We basically have created cradle to grave employment in one organization that's called a regulator that has its own problems. It does cater to development of specialized domain knowledge of that industry, but it has its own problems. Like cradle to grave is a very bad idea. You just get entrenched in a mindset, in a culture. You become unable to question the ways of your seniors because your seniors are going to be senior to you forever. Okay? The second deep reason why regulators were done worldwide was that the thinkers of government thought that there may actually be some benefits from breaking separation of powers. And this is huge. So since the 17th century, we have known that liberal democracy works well by dispersing power, and you disperse power of the state between union and state government and city, and you disperse the power of the state between legislative and executive and judicial branch. So the legislature controls the text of the IPC. Okay, is gay sex a crime or not is in the text of the IPC. The executive enforces against crimes. So they look at the text of the IPC and they look around the country looking for people who have violated, and they conduct an investigation and maybe a prosecution. And then they bring a case in front of the court, and a judge and only the judge has the power to punish a person. A civil servant should never have the power to punish you. The civil servant should not have the power to harm you. You should be completely unafraid of a civil servant. You should be completely unafraid of a legislator. Only a judge should be able to harm you. Okay, this is separation of powers. We've done a whole episode on this, and it's great. It has enormous sense. Regulators arose when genuinely good thinkers of government started wondering, could we do better by breaking a little bit of the separation of powers, specifically by fusing the legislative function, i.e. the power to write law, and the executive function, the power to enforce the law. Okay, let's make these together in one team. The world's most famous example of this is the United States SEC, the Securities and Exchanges Commission. This became a dedicated body. It came up in the 1930s during the Great Depression in the United States. The idea was to create a specialized team which would have deep knowledge of securities. The Congress is a generalist organization with politicians. They are unable to understand the fast-paced changing world of the securities markets. So they delegate certain regulation writing power to these unelected officials. And of course, it has to be done in a very careful and controlled way. It should not be a blanket power that you are the feudal lord of the securities market and you please write whatever regulations you want. It has to be very narrow, that in this problem there is this kind of market failure, so you are hereby given the power to write a regulation to deal with this kind of problem. This kind of narrow contracting out of lawmaking power needs to come from the parliament to the regulator. So the law that creates a regulator needs to have this kind of careful, well-drafted paragraphs which give one narrow power after another. So when you say there's an airports regulator, you will tell him you are addressing a market failure called monopoly. Your airports have a monopoly. So you will do a regulation of the equity rate of return of the airport by using ABCD methods. Not you're a feudal lord of airports and you will decide everything. What shall be the color of the mirrors in the loo will be controlled by you. Okay, so there needs to be this kind of careful surgical delegation of a lawmaking power to the regulator, and then that same team, the same people also perform executive actions. What do? They police the landscape, they look for violations of these regulations, and they create an investigation packet, and they make decisions about prosecution. Okay, so it's a very big milestone, and all of us need to wake up and notice that, oh my God, you have violated separation of powers. Okay, and this is the global concept of a regulator. This is the way regulators work the world over. Okay, so as an example, in the UK, there is a financial conduct agency. They do consumer protection for financial firms, and this is exactly what they do. That there's a single FCA which covers all finance. It writes regulations about consumer protection. It polices the financial system looking for violations. It can conduct an investigation, and it can decide that I think this merits a prosecution. Then they take the packet to a normal court, which is called the administrative tribunal. Then the financial firm will defend themselves in that court. Okay, this is a regulator as it is understood in the world, and these agencies have come up all over the world. Okay, so at the price of some violation of separation of powers, you've chosen to fuse two things here, and at the price of a very uncomfortable delegation of power to unelected officials, lawmakers are able to create specialized technical agencies who are supposed to know more, who are supposed to respond to a fast changing world and come out with regulations more rapidly. And it has its own dangers, it has its own concerns. But that is part of the answer of why would you bother creating a regulator. So in an ideal world, this is the theory, that the regulator will be able to have domain knowledge, it will have specialized people, it will stay focused on one industry for a long period of time, it will have surgically careful delegation of precise regulatory powers by the parliament to the regulator, saying on this you have the power to write this kind of limited law on my behalf. You are my agent for the business of drafting the law. Please note, you're not a feudal lord. You don't have unchecked powers. You don't have the ability to write whatever laws you want. And then you, the very same you, have the ability to do an investigation. So it's like the police and the parliament have been fused into one agency, and you can carry it till prosecution. This is the global theory about why regulators might be interesting.
That sounds amazing. It also sounds unfamiliar. Is that how regulators in India work?
Some very strange and remarkable things happened in India. And this goes back to the broader lack of knowledge in India about the basics of political science and public administration. Organizations like the RBI and the SEBI started combining not just the legislative power to write a regulation and the executive power to do investigations and licensing and prosecution, but also the judicial power of awarding a punishment. Suddenly, you now have a monster of 17th century political philosophy, that we have fused the legislative function and the executive function and the judicial function. And at this point, we needed people to wake up and start saying, like, this is not on. Separation of powers is a part of the basic structure of the Constitution of India. We have done an entire episode on it. And for the people that know political science and history and constitutional philosophy, this is not on. And it's a comment on the backwardness of India, about India as a third world country, that this kind of knowledge was not present in India. Okay, so I know many of the people that laid the foundations of RBI and SEBI personally. These are wonderful people. These are my friends. I look up to these people. I admire the people. These are great, good human beings. They meant well. But this is knowledge, and they just did not have that knowledge. So recklessly, we started building towards agencies that combined all these powers together into a single agency. And worse, very low levels of rule of law. Okay, you correctly did that checklist, that what is the rule of law? The people should know the law. The law should be equally enforced on everybody. There should be due process about how the process of enforcement against people takes place. There should be an unbiased hearing where the accused is able to defend herself. And the law should be predictable for long periods of time. There should not be sudden changes, frequent changes in the law. All these five were not there anywhere in the picture. How does all this happen? There's a parliamentary law that writes the code of each regulator. And in that code, you need all these things. The rule of law needs to be coded into the law that creates a RBI or a airport's economic regulatory authority. The surgical control of what kind of regulation making power you have needs to be written into the law that creates the airport's economic regulatory authority. And separation of powers, like, it is awkward and concerning when you've fused a legislative and an executive function, but you can't go all the way to the power to award punishments. That's a different level of problem altogether. And these three things were fused into regulators in India, and that gave us a really bad environment. Dr. M. Sahu is a storied career in the history of regulation in India. He's worked in the Ministry of Finance, he's worked in the NSE, He's worked in SEBI, he's worked in the Competition Commission, he was the first chairman of the bankruptcy regulator, and I'm sure 5 more things that I've forgotten. He was the first person who understood this in 2012. He wrote a paper and he started doing talks. And for me, it was just like, wow, how did I not know this? Bracket. I was a clueless economist, and we're just not paying enough attention to constitutional philosophy, law, political science. And then, what were the philosophers of India doing? What were the law experts of India doing? What were the political science people of India doing? And of course, my baradari, what were the economists doing? We just had a comprehensive intellectual failure. These stories are what wake me up, and they always tell me that the site of action to become a great country is to build intellectual power. You need a better community. A country can only be as good as its thinkers. And this is a great demo of that. The people meant well. If there was knowledge in the intelligentsia, in the elite of that period about these things, the laws would have been drafted correctly. Just nobody knew. And until Dr. Sahu started campaigning like, guys, what have we done? Like, this doesn't make any sense. Since the 17th century, we have known these kinds of things go badly. And then the problems of rule of law. I want to put yourself in the shoes of being a regulated person. Imagine you're an airport. Imagine you're a bank. Okay. Imagine you're a firm that comes under the regulation of one of these regulators. And really, the economic philosophy underlying these laws is that you're a feudal lord. The regulator is the lord. They will do your central planning. They'll tell you what to do. And if you ever act uppity, they can destroy your business because they have all the power. They can deny people licenses. They can award punishments without due process. There is no transparency. You don't even know who's getting punished. And your life is in their hands. What is the firm going to do? The firm is going to shut up. So the regulated persons lose all freedom of speech. So now you've got a small little world where there is a regulator and there is an industry that is controlled by the regulator. It is complete absolute power, where you can write regulations, you can control licensing, you can award punishment, and the business people look up. They know that their life and death is in the hands of these civil servants, and so they will be obedient. They will say yes sir. Okay, and there will be no freedom of speech. There will be no meaningful intellectual discussion around what is the nature of this central planning that has sprung up. Of course, the staff of the regulator will enjoy being comprehensive central planners. So there is a deep misconception on the part of a lot of people that thanks to the 1991 reforms, we got a great decline of central planning in India. This is largely not true, because actually something like 75% of the economy came under the footprint of regulators. And we got more detailed, more intrusive central planning backed by hundreds of employees walking around these industries, controlling them in more intrusive detail than ever before. So earlier, at least, the Indian state was far away. And in your ground lived reality, you could do whatever you wanted. That changed. Once these kinds of organizations came up, they got intrusive, detailed control of every product and every process of each of these firms. They control industries. So you get a headline like XYZ regulator has introduced this product. Okay, it should make you see red. The introduction of a product should be by a firm. Firms should be thinking, innovating, launching products. No, that's not how India works. The regulator introduces the product. Why? Because the regulator says everything is banned. You got to come to me. You got to take my permission. I will not allow you to launch a product until I approve the product. Okay, this is central planning of the worst order. It doesn't end there. It's not just at the product. It is processes. They intrude inside the working of the firms. They tell the firm, this is how this department will work. You should have this kind of process. They control the firms in a deep and intrusive way. Let me tell you a story. Many, many years ago, this may not be the way it works today. Many, many years ago, a bank applied for the following approval. They wanted to promote consumers learning how to use ATMs. Okay, so previously, people loved to go to a bank branch and withdraw cash. They wanted people to come to a ATM, put in their ATM card, type in a password, say I want 5,000 rupees, get cash. And they wanted to encourage people to do this. So they thought that, the Cadbury's chocolate 5-star, they wanted that candy bar to be stored inside the ATM. So each time you withdraw more than 5,000 rupees, it will also spit out a 5-star to you. Okay, like this is the business judgment of the firm. It should be the birthright of the firm. So sad story number one, they had to go take approval of the regulator. Okay, that should bother us right there. Sad story two, the approval was denied because the regulator said it is undignified along with cash. How can you give a 5-star candy? We don't like it. We will ban it. Okay. So I want you to see the deep connections between all these pieces. When you violate separation of powers, you get monolithic power. That's the essence of what we knew from the 17th century, that when a state fuses too much power, it becomes too powerful, and that scares the private sector. When you don't have rule of law, that scares the private sector. Then the private sector goes quiet. The private sector stops talking, it stops complaining, it stops criticizing. You get a silence of the graveyard in the public domain. People only praise the regulators. They all say, oh, it is so great. And of course, now every regulated entity who gets in wants the licensing constraints to block anybody else from coming in. And then their job is to suck up to the regulator and say kind things, go meet them, lobby with them, campaign with them all the time, always done in a very solicitous way that, oh sir, you are so great. Just one small thing like you must ban this or you must prevent this or that person is doing that. You should go raid them and make sure that they don't do these kinds of things. And that gives you a complete intrusive central planning environment. You lose competition, you lose innovation, you lose dynamism. This is one of the most important elements of how India lost the growth dynamic of 1991 to 2011.
It's such a scary story, and I didn't know the extent of this till, in fact, just now. So I'm still kind of reeling from the shock. You know, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely, and this is like a huge level of oppressive power, and yeah, horrifying. I need to recover. Let's have a chapter break.
You need a coffee.
So Ajay, for the sake of gentle readers, you know, give us a bulleted summary of what is wrong with the regulatory state in India as you just laid out.
So let's take inputs and outcomes. Okay, inputs. What is wrong with regulators in India is that their founding laws give them sweeping power to make laws as unelected officials. Their founding laws give them extreme concentration of power in violation of separation of powers. They have a combination of legislative, executive, and judicial powers. There is a low level of rule of law, so it all becomes arbitrary power. Okay, so this is the input about what is wrong. What is the outcome? The outcome is that we have lost dynamism, we have lost innovation, we have lost entry, we have lost the competition and the creative destruction of the market economy, and it is an important source of why Indian GDP growth went down after 2011.
So Ajay, how do we fix this?
Here is a simple conceptual framework of how to fix it. The first is that the power to write law at regulators needs to be greatly narrowed down. Okay, in constitutional jargon, there is excessive delegation. The parliament can't give unchecked powers to write law to unelected officials. So each situation where a regulation can be written needs to be a high quality section of law where there is an objective, there are balancing considerations, that on one hand you could go wrong in this direction, on the other hand you could go wrong in this direction, and now you look at the world and form a judgment of what is the appropriate balance, and based on that you write a regulation. So thought needs to be applied in how section by section of the parliamentary law delegates regulation making power to the regulator. Second, the legislative and the executive functions need to be thoroughly covered with rule of law procedures. Right now the laws are just skimpy. You can do whatever you want. Whereas actually you need hundreds of sections of law to tie down that what is the due process that will be followed to make a regulation. Okay, because you are not an elected official, you have a shortfall of democratic legitimacy. So there is a whole procedure about how regulations should be made, and there are checks and balances, and the people are on board able to criticize how the regulations are being made, and that way the quality of the laws that are written by the regulator will be better. Similarly, on the executive side, licensing. It can't be an arbitrary power that I will give somebody a license, I will not give somebody a license. There has to be due process around it. It should be possible for the aggrieved person to appeal that if you denied me a license, it is tantamount to your harming me. And under rule of law, when I am harmed, I should be able to appeal to a higher judicial authority. At present, it's just like, no, we don't like you, go away, we'll not give you a license. Okay, so a whole set of rule of law procedures need to be brought in around the executive function. So both for the legislative function and the executive function, the whole battery of process requirements are required, whereby these organizations are not a case of unchecked power, but actually have checks and balances. Then you come to the judicial power. You could view it two ways. One way is we want a whole check and balance whereby there are judges sitting inside a regulatory organization who are issuing orders, and you could do that, and I have been part of that kind of design work. But my views have shifted because of some really excellent research that has been going on the working of the Bombay High Court and the Delhi High Court in my organization XKDR Forum. The old tropes about the process inefficiency of the high courts are becoming less true. High courts are improving in terms of the way in which they work. So today I am increasingly starting to think, do it like the UK, do it like Australia, that the regulator can develop a packet and then if they decide to prosecute, go to the High Court. Let a true judge hear the case. Let the firm defend itself. At the High Court, you don't even need to have a judicial function inside the regulatory organization. All these things have to happen in the primary law. So the site of action is the drafting of the law that makes the airport's economic regulatory authority. It needs a great bag of regulatory theory to be applied. And in this, I want to say to everybody that you have heard me talk about all these issues: separation of powers, rule of law, procedures, checks and balances. All this is actually generic. It is not about SEBI, it is not about FSSAI, it is not about RERA, it's actually a general technology. So as has been done in many other countries, there's a brilliant piece of law in the United States which was done in 1946. Okay, don't you envy these countries? In 1946, there was a general law which is called the Administrative Procedures Act, which was a Republican pushback against democratic creation of too many federal agencies. It's a general law that covers all federal agencies. So Administrative Procedures Act. It's not for SEC, it's not for one particular organization after another. It's a general law that applies to all federal agencies. And it is this kind of thing that establish separation of powers is already in the Constitution of the United States, and establish checks and balances, establish rule of law procedures. A lot of the heavy lifting is done in court, that when a regulator misbehaves, the aggrieved party challenges it in court, and that's how jurisprudence got built up over the years that constrains the working of regulators in America. When we had done the separation of powers episode, at the end we had talked about two very important developments that have taken place in the last 2-3 years in the American landscape about the SEC, the right to a jury trial being used to knock out the ability to run trials inside the SEC, and about Chevron doctrine. Okay, so these are very big developments, and the courts are all over the working of these regulatory agencies, as it should be. That is a healthy way to approach this. So this is the way forward, that we need to aim for the deeper regulatory theory transformation of the laws that create the regulators, whereby we are re-establishing separation of powers, and we are creating checks and balances, and we are creating process requirements through which these things will operate.
So Ajay, this is not thankfully where the story ends. Tell me about FSLRC.
The regulators in India evolved over many decades, where I said some of the best people in India did not bring the correct level of knowledge of politics, of the constitution, of law, of public administration and economics on market failure into the working of these organizations. So over the years, you started seeing many maladies developing. Okay, if you look at the 2000s on the Leap blog, on the working papers at NIPFP, at IGIDR, you started getting a large body of research coming out in this field, and this new field started developing of studying regulators in India and of starting to ask questions about a regulatory theory. In 2011, the great Indian finance minister Pranab Mukherjee kicked off an important project which is called the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission. Okay, so this was begun by KP Krishnan when he was inside the DEA, and it was carried forward by his successors in the Department of Economic Affairs after he left. This was chaired by Justice Sri Krishna, and yours truly had a role in this. Because I was made to face the only job interview of my entire life. I was interviewed by Justice Sri Krishna for the position of becoming the technical team that would support FSLRC, and that is how in the end Ila Patnaik and I co-led the research team that supported the commission. So the commission was led by Justice Sri Krishna, and Ila and I led the technical team that worked for the commission. What FSLRC did was a clean, simple, modern law which replaces 60 bad financial laws that have crept up over the decades, and it's broken up into two parts. First, it has about 140 sections of law which are this regulatory theory. Okay, so what is the board of a regulator? What is the composition of the board of the regulator? What are the powers of the board of the regulator? How will voting take place in the board of the regulator? What is the legislative process? What is the executive process? What is the investigative powers of a regulator? Like that, the whole public administration of how a regulator works, and this is a general technology, was done as 140 sections. That is the first part of the draft law that was done. The second part of the draft law that was done was across the entire financial system. What's the market failure? Why might you like to have government intervention? And then those specific sections, one section after another, where there is this problem, there is a need of a regulation. On one hand, it could be like this. On the other hand, it could be like that. Now you, the regulator, will look at the state of technology and markets at time t in the future, and based on that you will write one narrow regulation to perform this limited delegation, not sweeping unchecked regulatory powers. FSLRC also contains a financial regulatory agency architecture. So who are all the orgs created by the parliament to do all this work? So there'll be one financial agency called the RBI, it will do ABC. There will be one financial agency called the Public Debt Management Agency, which will do investment banking for the government. There'll be one financial agency which will, like that. So the whole agency map was thought about from an accountability point of view, from checks and balances point of view. So that is FSLRC. I also recommend to everybody that please read volume 1 of FSLRC as well. So the FSLRC report is 2 volumes. We'll have the URLs in the show notes. Volume 1 is a conceptual document. So note, this was done from 2011 to 2013, and then 800 public comments were received, and these came back to the same team, and they were processed over 2 more years. And in 2015, all this work got done. So overall, it was a 4-year project from 2011 to 2015. Volume 1 is a crisp summary of 20 years of research on regulation and regulatory theory in India, yielding elegant, compact chapters that on this issue, here's how we will think, and there is a box of drafting instructions, and that box gets tossed over to the law drafting team, which would then draft the law. Okay, and then volume 2 is the draft law. And I will say without exaggeration, because I'm not a lawyer, that we had the best law drafting team ever since independent India happened. And this is the cleanest, well drafted, modern quality law drafting project that has been done in Indian history. Most laws in India are drafted very shabbily. This is really a role model for how laws should be drafted. So this is a 2-volume product. One is a simple English statement of what needs to be done, ending in drafting instructions. And then volume 2 is a sweet, clean, elegant draft law which does the complete finance. So that's FSLRC. It got done 2011 to 2015. In a way, the project is a failure because we're standing 10 years later and that law has not been drafted. But that's not a correct model of how democracies make progress. Okay, that's not the correct theory of change, that there will be one cathedral where some people will do one big project and then lo and behold, suddenly everything will get done. Actually, the journey of progress, it's our theory of change episode. The journey of progress is a story of intellectual persuasion. We need to create such intellectual products and persuade and persuade and persuade. And one by one, these ideas start creeping into practice. So many ideas from the FSLRC project have one by one started turning into reality. As an example, a biggie was inflation targeting. Okay, you and I have done many episodes around the ideas of inflation targeting. Well, that was one of the pieces of the grand FSLRC work, that you're going to create a central bank. What will the objectives of a central bank be? How will you hold a central bank accountable? How do you create dispersed power for the voting at a monetary policy committee, rather than absolute power that some governor will decide what the interest rate should be? All these ideas were incubated inside the law that was the Indian Financial Code, the volume 2 of FSLRC. And some years later, they came out and they turned into a separate law. So that's the arc of progress, that we have built a body of knowledge in India that is called regulatory theory. And these are two critical documents that are visible in the public domain, but actually they are backed by a literature. There is intellectual power in hundreds of blog articles and dozens of research papers, which really fleshed out an Indian literature on what is going wrong under Indian conditions, and then debating what are the checks and balances, what would work under Indian conditions. So nobody said that you should take the Administrative Procedures Act and enact it here. That would be the subtle idea of why you can't transplant ideas from another country mechanically. You have to be here. You have to be deeply rooted here. You have to spend 20 years doing research here, understanding this locale, and solve problems under Indian conditions. So this is the Indian story about how knowledge on regulation and regulatory theory got built up, and how we are increasingly able to look at this landscape and talk sense about what is going on.
So Ajay, I have a two-part question. Like it's very heartening to hear about the drafting of FSLRC, and I'm going to read the first volume because you hadn't described it to me before like that. So even if it wasn't even if it hasn't been put into practice yet, we know what the long road to change is like. It's good that it exists. My two-part question is this: that part one, in the ecosystem of ideas, how much of an issue is it that so many people still don't know the fundamentals of philosophy, of political philosophy and all of these things? As you pointed out, you were a clueless economist in your words. I'm not calling you names. You were a clueless economist, and you hadn't seen the bigger picture about separation of powers and the rule of law, state accountability. And you might think, as an economist, do I really need to read political philosophy from the 17th century? Do I really need to go further back and know about the Magna Carta? And the answer, frankly, is yes. And this is a great lesson that you keep driving home to people, that depth isn't enough, that you know a subject well. You need that breadth to be able to have that context and figuring out. So question one is, in the ecosystem of ideas, is it still a problem that that broader sort of foundation of philosophical thinking is not embedded? I know you've taught in the IAS Academy at Mussoorie, for example. You've given talks there and all of that. But I would imagine that this is kind of where you begin, and then everything kind of flows from there. And the second question is a related question, and that's not about the ecosystem of ideas, but the ecosystem of ideas people. Like when we have done our Seen Unseen episode on the new pension scheme, one of the really sort of sad codas there is that there was an intellectual community which built up around that, which knew the policy intimately, which developed it and which took it forward to a certain point. But when that small group of people got dispersed, everything went to hell because there was no institutional memory, which leads me to wonder if reforms like the FSLRC are really outlier projects by a perfect storm of good people coming together at the right time in the right place. But broadly, the ecosystem of ideas isn't there yet, and the ecosystem of ideas people isn't there yet.
So first, I completely agree with you on the importance of the deep humanities knowledge. it is just a core for the country. We in India sacrificed humanities knowledge and we are paying a price for it. So this whole doctor engineer thing in India, that we protected STEM subjects to some extent, and we just have no interest in creating high quality law schools and philosophy departments, political science departments, public administration capabilities, and so on. And this is very costly for India. And while there is a certain amount of humanities capabilities in India, all too often it just turned into a simplistic political project around leftist ideas and social justice, which are actually not useful. You know, what you actually need is the great knowledge from the 17th century onwards about the basic pillars about how the advanced economies became advanced, rather than just a litany of woe about how there is structural inequality in the world. And then you don't actually know the great books. You're just getting into a social justice obsession without understanding the machinery about how great countries work. And this has been very costly for India. That, if you could do something different, I would really want there to be serious law schools in India where there is a genuine intellectual capability. Today in India at law school, they are taught this is a section of the Companies Act. Here's how you write contracts around it. Here's how you litigate around it. And so, for example, when occasionally there is a situation where somebody with a law school background is asked, what should this section be? Their capability goes to zero, because the problem of how to design a section of law lies completely somewhere else. It lies in public administration, it lies in political philosophy, it lies in public economics. It is every skill in the world other than what lawyers in India know. And that's a big problem, because finally lawyers are the coders. But then, okay, fine. What we did in FSLRC was we really built an amazing team on the law coding side. We created a training mechanism for them, whereby one of the world's top law drafters came and spent time running training sessions for them, both on how laws should be drafted and on the processes that should be used by a law drafting project. Okay, I'm very proud of the effort we took. We didn't accept that, oh, these are kids from top law schools in India, so they must be knowing how to draft a law. No, they don't know how to draft laws, and that's a different skill altogether. They are the coders, but then they should be no more than the coders. Then you need the thinkers who will actually be philosophers about the world, who will think about public administration, checks and balances, who will have history playing in their minds. You have to know about the rise of Nazi Germany to think about surveillance. If you don't know about authoritarianism, you won't understand surveillance. And in India, we just have callow youths reading law blogs in the West, where their entire invisible infrastructure is taken for granted, and then they are trying to think about what sections of the law should be. So we absolutely need this kind of humanities capability in India, and it is an important missing link. And because it is not pervasive, it is all the more important to create these small groups. Okay, so these are our research and reform teams. The future of India rides on creating and sustaining research and reform teams. Wherever they have come up and had staying power, then they have ultimately mattered in terms of creating the possibility of progress. It is not that the government will particularly listen, they are not obliged to listen. But in the arc of history, it does happen that problems bubble up. Finally, India is a third world country, it's a very poor country, many problems are there. And there comes a time where the problems rise to materiality, and then the top bosses are looking around shopping for ideas saying, I want expertise on X. At that time, you need the research and reform community that is available, where there are people, where there is expertise, who are able to participate in work, in public debates, who would have been able to respond when a whole variety of nonsense started being written around the pension reforms. There was just nobody there to defend it, because the serving officials don't understand it enough to talk about it. And there was no research and reform community available to stay engaged in the subject. And this again comes back to the theory of change. There are people in India who believe that if you take a college educated person who speaks English and give them as consulting staff to today's joint secretary and today's secretary, then that is the path to progress. Okay, I disagree. If you will work to the agenda of today's joint secretary and today's secretary, then that's not progress. Then you're just being an HR staffing agency. I mean, they should go buy the services of Bain Consulting by themselves. I mean, what's the value added of trying to say that we are participating in the progress of the country by working to augment the public finance envelope of the employees of government in doing their agenda? You have to go upstream, and the upstream is ideas. A country can only be as good as its thinkers. A country can only be as good as its research and reform communities who stay engaged in a subject, who write about it in the public domain, who create intellectual leadership, who are able to debate the evolving world and criticize things as they unfold. And then they are there, actually they are 5 years and 10 years and 20 years of knowledge ahead of the joint secretary and the secretary. Otherwise, what's the point? So in all my work in public policy, I've always rudely said to young people working for me that if you don't have expertise, you have no right to have any engagement with public policy. If you're just going to be a junior staffer, that you have some economics degree, some law degree, do not believe that you have any business getting involved in anything in the world of public policy. To do public policy, you have to have mastery, you have to have expertise. Otherwise, like, please go work in a bank.
Gentle reader, if you're watching this and you're thinking, I'm an economist, I want to do public policy, but these guys make it sound like labor, 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 no fruit. I want to tell you, sometimes there is fruit. And this brings us to the second good news of this episode. Ajay Shah, go for it.
Yeah, this is truly mango season. We have two happy stories in one episode. So let me take one small piece of this giant agenda of regulatory theory and show you the journey of progress. Okay, how does change come about? So step one, FSLRC. Okay, and there is a whole tool chain in FSLRC on how to address the problem of democratic legitimacy. How dare an unelected official write a law? Okay, if we had any philosophers worth their salt in India, they should be standing up and saying, how dare you? You're an unelected official. How dare you have the power to write law? Okay, and then FSLRC has a whole toolkit on how to create that democratic legitimacy. It involves the role and composition of the board. It involves a certain procedure. It involves public consultation. It involves expertise. Okay, so these are the ingredients. You need a majority of independent directors on the board of an agency, that it should be private people, not civil servants, who dominate the board of every regulatory agency. The beginning and ending of every regulation making project should be at the board. And so the majority private people have to approve the regulation. This is getting back to democratic legitimacy, that the people agreed that this regulation should be done. Inside the staff of the regulatory agency, they should articulate an objective and write it down, that what problem in the world is this regulation intended to solve. Because if you don't write down an objective, you can always claim something else later. How do you judge, did it work, did it not work? Demonstrate that it's a market failure. Go through 6 alternative ways in which you could potentially address that market failure. Do a cost benefit analysis for all the 6. Choose the lowest cost measure that gets the job done. Draft a regulation that embeds all these ideas. Put this out for public comment for 90 days. Let the people read this draft and criticize it. And have enough of a research and reform community in the country who will be there to, show you that this is incorrect, or potentially to help you on how to do the cost benefit analysis. Come back to the board saying that we drafted this, this is the way folks criticized it. And then the board, and only the board, should think that, okay, criticism 7 seems correct, so let's change the draft law. Note, majority independent citizens, not civil servants, on the board. Okay, and at the end of this kind of process, the law can get issued. Okay, this is the FSLRC script of how a regulation should be made. You just get out of this nonsense that some junior person imagines, writes some bad quality law, maybe gets some lawyers, maybe gets some consultants to write a law, and tomorrow it's out on a website. This is just shoddy, shabby work. Nobody should be doing that work. I mentioned Dr. Sahu a moment ago, who is a wonderful person and an important part of the Indian regulatory theory story. In 2012, he was one of the first people to start telling us, this violation of separation of powers is a core problem that has happened with regulators in India, and actually it is unprecedented. Like dunya mein, you don't get this sort of thing. Dr. Sahu was a board member at the brand new insolvency and bankruptcy regulator of India. Okay. A little bit of a sad story. Okay, Susan led the team that did the first draft of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. We talked about this in our episode on bankruptcy. The 140 sections of FSLRC, of the checks and balances about how a regulator should work, had been imported into that draft law by that team. Okay, Unfortunately, it went into the belly of the government and all that got deleted. And the bad 15 sections from the SEBI Act were imported there. So that was a lost opportunity. Then Dr. Sahu became the first chairman of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Regulator. And he knows all this stuff. He's a master of all this same knowledge. He has worked as part of the FSLRC project and so on. And he said, what am I going to do? Like, this law does not impose checks and balances on me, but I know that without checks and balances, this is going to go badly. So he thought that just like when you don't have the law done correctly, you still have an agreement between the Ministry of Finance and the RBI to block printing money to pay for the deficit, or an agreement between the Ministry of Finance and the RBI for inflation targeting. Like that, can we make progress with something that is semi-legal even though it's not in the law? So he did separation of powers inside the IBBI. He separated out 3 departments. That there will be a legislative function, an executive function, and a judicial function. And the IBBI board enacted a regulation governing how IBBI makes regulations, where some but not all of these good practices were imported in. Okay, to a decent extent, the extent to which you could take a subset out of what I described as the FSLRC rule making procedure, regulation making procedure, was imported into this regulation to govern how IBBI makes regulations. So this was done, I think, in 2016 or 2017 at IBBI. Then it slumbered there for some years. Then recently there was a lot of thought around how SEBI can become better, how SEBI can become stronger. And SEBI did the same thing. SEBI came out with a regulation on making regulations, where that same bag of ideas was imported into SEBI. And today is the happy day when in the early morning I got an SMS that this has been done by RBI. So now today you have 3 regulatory organizations where the board has approved a regulation that governs how the organization makes regulations. And it's not the end of the journey. There'll be many steps to go. But I think it's an important milestone. At this point, I think the intellectual argument has been won. A journey that began in the 2000s has reached winning the intellectual journey in 2025. Okay? At this point, I think nobody in good faith in India can argue that, oh yeah, it's a regulator, we have unchecked power, we can just make regulations as we like. Now, there is humility, and then there will be the question how. And it will take another 10 years to figure out how to do this. How do you build the state capability to make regulations? How do you become more controlled? What is market failure? Okay, imagine a generation of civil servants are going to understand what is market failure, how to do cost benefit analysis. It's great, it takes time. And we hope now in the future, when new laws are drafted, when amendments to laws are drafted, this kind of tool chain will actually go into the laws where it can be done better. The version that you get as the board of a regulator establishing checks and balances on the staff of the regulator is not as good as what the parliament can do to establish checks and balances on the very agency. So I'm not saying that we are done, but I am saying that we are at an important milestone. This is a big day in the 25-year journey of regulatory theory, and this is also a demo of our theory of change. This is how progress happens.
One baby step at a time, the infant crawls away from the precipice, but it can still hear the labored breathing of the monster. I want to give you a fist bump. Well done. Well done. And you know, this is inspiring that 25 saal lagte hai. So basically now I'm thinking 23 years later, everything will have its first viral video. That is my hope. Laughing like that. Do you think it won't happen even then?
Much before.
Much before? What are you even saying? It could be this. I don't think it'll be this, but yeah, we'll keep trying.
Yeah. So Amit, I have babbled about regulation all day now. Please give us a great recommendation for a book on regulation.
You're going to get a behind the scenes clip now.
Next episode I'll have 7. Ignore this for now.
You heard him.
But in the next step, I'm giving you 5. I promise next step I will have 5 recommendations.
Right, you promised 7 recommendations for this episode. Recommendations? Where I said it's time for regulations and he said next episode I will give 7, I have none now. Every episode he does this, the 7s are multiplying. आप भी 25 साल बाद recommendation दोगे क्या? Compound interest. The book I want to recommend is called, I will have to read out the name. is called Regulation, a Primer by Susan Dudley and Jerry Brito. Wonderful book. It's mostly about how regulation works in America, but the first and last chapters are relevant to the overall general purpose theory of regulation, covers some of the areas you covered, but nowhere near as comprehensively. So this episode is actually the recommendation. So please watch this episode, but if you are watching this, you already have. So please watch it again.
No, gentle reader, I want to show you Amit's level of commitment to this book. It is sitting in his loo. It is his loo time reading.
So you must have sneaked into my loo at my home in Andheri at some point in time. Please do not reveal any of the other books you saw there.